Bueno.
Hola, Abel.
Buenos días, Victoria.
Buenos días.
¿Qué tal? Un gusto saludarte.
Hello, Victoria. How are you? It's a pleasure to see you here. Welcome.
Welcome, Abel.
Let's wait for everyone to join the meeting.
Yes. We are waiting.
I'm feeling good.
For Leonor and Sonia.
Let's wait for the rest and Sonia too.
Yes.
We are waiting for Sonia.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Sonia is there. Buenos dias, Sonia. Bom dia.
Good morning. Good morning.
Okay, so we will start in 1 minute. I think we are.
Okay, so Eds will very quickly give the house rules and then turn it over to Vicky as the moderator.
So,
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar, Living Under Threat, Responding to the Collective Impacts of Increasing Violence Against and Criminalization of Indigenous Peoples. Before we begin our program, a few reminders to our attendees today. Please keep your audio on mute. Interpretations in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish are available. Please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to select a language. Interpretations for the webinar are provided by DOSIP, Indigenous Peoples Center for Documentation, Research, and Information. If you want to speak to the panel and other participants, you may click the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you wish to get the attention of the moderator, click the raise hand button. If you want to ask questions, you may click the Q&A button. Your questions will be asked during the open forum. As we wait for the program to start, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Type in your name, your organization, and your country. This webinar will be streaming live on IPRI's social media pages. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The link to IPRI's social media pages will be posted on the chat box. Please feel free to share our posts and tag us. You may also post your questions on Facebook and Twitter. You may use the following hashtags when you post on social media. Hashtag Living Under Threat, hashtag Human Rights Day 2020, hashtag Indigenous Peoples, and hashtag Indigenous Rights. For today's webinar, our moderator is IPRI Co-Director, Ma'am Vicky Tauli-Corpuz.
okay. Good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It's very good to be able to have this webinar. We are holding this webinar in time for the celebration of the anniversary of the Declaration of International Human Rights Day, which is December 10. No, but we wanted to hold it earlier so that those who have activities on December 10 will be able to attend this as well. So we are very fortunate to have with us several of our speakers whom I will introduce later. But for this particular webinar, as was mentioned earlier by Edna, we are going to look at the situation of indigenous peoples who are living under threats of violence and criminalization. And the main objectives of our webinar is to underline the importance of the collective rights of indigenous peoples and the collective nature of the impacts of violations of their human rights. And we will be dealing with 4 of our focus countries in IPRI, which is Brazil, Colombia, Philippines, and Mexico. IPRI is an indigenous organization which has been set up in 2019. It's a very new organization, and its aim is to look into the situation of criminalization of and violence against indigenous peoples worldwide, and to respond to this situation through campaigns, research, documentation, and through advocacy. Today, we have with us 4 of the key leaders in the countries where we are focusing the work of IPRI, and I will introduce them as they speak. My name is Vicky Tauli-Corpuz. I am the co-director of IPRI. I used to be the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I made a report on the situation of criminalization of indigenous peoples, which gives a general picture of what indigenous peoples are facing. In addition to looking at the situation, of course, we would like to share the relevance of the work of IPRI and to focus on the collective dimensions of these problems. And we specifically focus on the collective dimensions, because many of the individual impacts are better known more than the collective impacts. I will introduce Sonia Guadjahara. Welcome, Sonia. Sonia Guadjahara is Guadjahara from Maranhão, the state of Maranhão in Brazil. And she is the executive coordinator of APIB, the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples in Brazil, which is the national network of Indigenous Peoples organizations. And she is a member of the International Advisory Group of IPRI. She ran for vice president in Brazil in the last election. So she has a lot to share with us. I'm giving her first the floor because I think she has to go to another place. But Sonia, I know you will be focusing on the issues of how the human rights protection in Brazil have regressed. But I also know that you would like to talk about the extent of the murders and assassination of indigenous leaders in Brazil, the impact of the Marco Temporal decision that is being discussed now in the Supreme Court, as well as the situation of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation in Brazil, and the impacts of evangelical missionaries, as well as the situation of mining in your country. So I'm giving you the floor now, and I'm giving you, for all the speakers, I'm giving you 7 minutes for your general introduction. But for Sonia, I'll give her a longer time because she is going to leave us afterwards. So Sonia, welcome, and you have the floor. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Once again, thank you for the opportunity of being here, participating in this most valuable example that reminds this Declaration of the Human Rights. Tomorrow, International Day of Human Rights. So today we are doing this webinar to commemorate and to claim respect to these rights. I will ask Manja to put my presentation for us to illustrate a bit this situation in Brazil today. Here we're talking about the criminalization of the Indian leaderships in Brazil. Here is a general panorama. Next slide, please. Well, so nowadays we have as a main threat to the rights of the indigenous peoples in Brazil, the president of himself, the federal government, which has declared anti-indigenous and our main enemy. So this official speech of the present government excites and authorizes violence, physical, symbolic violence against the Brazilian indigenous peoples in our ancestry lands and the natural resources, because this discourse eventually is practiced by the government, but also impact the whole society as a whole, and those who intend to commit these practices of violence. Next slide, she asks. Next slide, please. What are the main reasons for this, the increase of criminality against indigenous in Brazil? There is the progress of this conservative agenda, the flexibilization of the environmental legislation, the weakening of the control bodies and fiscalization, the large agribusiness, the large mining enterprises, and the religious missionaries, fundamentalist ones, and land grabbing, the occupation of public land, which the government is legalizing, and this Mercosur agreement, which is also for us a pressure, a huge pressure upon our lands and also upon our rights. This request for production pressures the public lands and especially indigenous lands. And so this eventually creates a huge conflict, whether for land possession or land invasion, and loggers or illegal gold diggers. Next slide, she asks. So with all this, we have a hate campaign in Brazil. This campaign is driven by the federal government, encouraged by the federal government, and is carried out by different sectors of the society. So those people who do not like someone or does not like the Indian, he can do an act of violence because he believes in there will be no punishment. The impunity is the main tool of promotion of criminality against the indigenous. It's the certainty of being acquitted. So this hate campaign is driven by whom? By the authorities that eventually spread this prejudice, and they have the public, and the mass production of fake news, so many lies, and also the rowboats, the boats, the feedback loops, which are created in order to produce a fake reality about the issues of interest of a conservative agenda, an extreme right agenda. So the use of the strategies has a feedback, and its own dynamic, which use the repetition of content and fragmentation of the audience in order to strike the rights of indigenous peoples. This is a reality which impacts us strongly. Nowadays, the indigenous peoples and provoke the increase of violence and criminalization against the indigenous. Next slide, she asks. What are the main consequences of all of this? We have land invasion, flexibilization of the environmental legislation, a government that has no responsibility for the environment at all, provokes the logging as compared to the last year, an increase of logging, the burning, forest fires in the Pantanal and in Amazon, and land grabbing, and also illegal logging, and the forced evangelization of the indigenous peoples who live in voluntary isolation. Nowadays, the National Foundation for the Indian is itself, they work against the rights and autonomy of the peoples, promoting the forced evangelization, the authorization for land grabbing. Next slide. So here we have this new enemy, and this makes us do this fighting against the Brazilian state structures. The authorities are harassing us, persecuting us, and condemning us, trying to prevent us to denounce the genocide which is going on in Brazil at the moment. Our partners are being criminalized. The NGOs and indigenous and environmental organizations, and they are suffering. They are being subject to charges, to legal charges. So we're increasing our network and strengthening our partnership with our movements so that we can strengthen our positions. Perhaps being together, we can better face the government, and not for the government to try to subdue us, to conquer us, but the opposite. Next slide, she asks. So I thank you all for the space, and we carry on our fight against the increase of violence and criminalization. Yesterday in Brazil, we launched a dossier that showed 3 years of criminalization and violence against the indigenous people. And so we can also share this document. Tomorrow, we'll be launching a report, the report of the impact of the pandemic among the indigenous peoples. This will be tomorrow, 3 p.m. Brazil, in the parliamentary front for the defense of the indigenous peoples. Here's the invitation for everybody to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. This is very, thank you for covering comprehensively the situation of the violations of the collective rights of indigenous peoples in Brazil. If you recall, I did, as a special rapporteur, I visited Brazil in March 2016, and the same issues that you have presented to me were the issues that I have found when I did the visit. And in fact, I had very concrete recommendations related to what you were saying. I recommend that my first recommendation was to urge the government of Brazil to institute immediate measures to protect the safety of indigenous leaders. And I know even you, as one of the leaders, is also subjected to these kinds of treatment at present. So I would just like to ask you maybe in briefly, what is it that you would like IPRI to do to support the fight that you are doing against these violations of your collective rights and the criminalization that's happening there?
The IPRI can do many things, can help a lot to protect the leaderships which are being criminalized. We are now talking with different leaderships, every leadership talking about their reality and what can be done. We can present later a report on this situation. We have the temporal framework which is going on, what you mentioned in the beginning. It was already. Several trials are being carried out as if the temporary framework was already law. And this is meant for the indigenous to limit the time. And the Bolsonaro government, 114 farms have been already regularized, and which has been titled to farmers. We must continue the pressure against this advancement of the agribusiness and this economic model, which is highly predatory to our lands. We also need to increase the visibility on the situation of the peoples who live in voluntary isolation, who are ever more threatened by this religious missionaries and fundamentalist religions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sonia. I know you, if even after you leave, we have Carolina who can help respond to some of the questions if there will be questions that will be raised later. So thank you so much. I would like now to move to Leonor Salabata, who is from the, she is a leader, she's an indigenous leader from the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta del Cesar in Colombia. And she is a human rights commissioner for the Tairona Indigenous Confederation. She is a representative of the Commission of Indigenous Peoples of Colombia. And presently, she is a member of the Global Board of IPRI. Leonor, you have the floor. You will give your general statement, and then later I will ask some questions from you. So you have the floor, please.
Gracias, buenos días para todos y todas. Saludos a Vicky.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Victoria. Hello, all the panelists and all of you that are here listening to us. Yes, you're right. We can talk about celebration. We're trying to commemorate it, the Day of Human Rights. A day, and we're hoping that one day it could be a celebration, but it has to do with the balance and the stability we can get and how we can get the peace for everyone and especially for indigenous people. I want to make reference to the subject that this webinar is about. I would ask to share the slides and the PowerPoint so I can start my presentation.
Bien. Efectivamente, el tema de Colombia tiene que ver mucho con antes y después del proceso de las firmas para el proceso de paz en Colombia. Nosotros no podemos exactamente pensar en que
We didn't think actually that you can't have the peace if you don't stop war. The violation of rights is not hampered. Our population in Colombia is a population that sorry, just a moment. Yeah, a population, I said, that is 4.4% of the whole of the population of the country. But due to the situation in which we live in our territories, this population has been restricted statistically. And it's restricted because there is no adequation of the situation. And we recognize that during this, we can call it a statistic genocide in Colombia. We can speak about the census that we have in this moment now. And I think they take into account that the population is much higher. Population is restricted to 36.6% of the Colombian person, following the official opinion of the Statistics Bureau of Colombia. But it has lots of things to do with the violation of human rights and to the genocide. In 156 indigenous territories, there was a loss of population. According to the census, they ignored the concept or the idea of the indigenous territory as they are protected by the international tools. The accumulation of this land grabbing in these communities degenerate persons. There was a loss of agricultural lands, and they stopped belonging to the activity, and so they were left without territories. Really, it's something historic. More and more, they are losing their defense of rights and their territories. And all this against the mandate of the Constitution. And this happened. If you can please pass to the next slide, please. During the period 2016-2019, the homicides of indigenous leaders concentrated basically on the departments of Cauca, Nariño, Chocó, and Putumayo. But in all the departments, also Antioquia, Rojida, and many others. We also have cases of, what I'm trying to say is that the majority of the cases is there, but there is no, how could I call it? There's a victimization also in our territories. The massacres and homicide, the reduction of massacres and homicide, but the deepening of our not lethal repertories for reducing the autonomy, the self-government, the capacity of defense of territories, with the objective of controlling and practicating land grabbing and imposing projects on our territories. So these massacres and violence is not the basic, it's not the only or the principal means of violence. There is a scaling. It's also a question that has been seen, but in this case, it's stronger. It is something that happens in a more open way with regard to what happened before. Could you please go to the next slide? In this situation of massacre of the indigenous population in Colombia, there are new forms of violence because they are being applied in the whole national territory in the sense of abuse of power. And we have a hegemonic development model. And this model has been implemented in Colombia nowadays with an abusive use of norms, laws, and institutions. The rights are administered, and we could even say abused of, are manipulated by the institutions who from this institution, they have the possibility to penetrate the indigenous territories, indigenous peoples, and their cultures. And this, I think, makes it possible that there are these violations of human rights in the populations of indigenous peoples. We could also find as another model of the abuse of power is this stigmatizing. What do I want to say with this? That criminalization that is performed in this stigmatizing speeches, like for instance saying that we indigenous people occupy 30% of the national area, that the indigenous peoples are peoples that should be brought to an education, brought to a formation or a training. And so there's this change where indigenous people should renounce to their culture in order to be mainstreamed, and so well what they aim to is to exit our territories. So here we see again this use of legality against our rights. And the fact is that we have demonstration, protests also that are happening, but this has to do with the way of acting of the state. Because when we ask the state for a solution for a specific problem, this is the only response is by means of using force, physical force. It's made by military or by the police, and with these abuses that are very clear during the moment when we are asking for our rights or our demonstration. So we are spoken at as guerrilleros, as using illegal means, and this goes against our rights as indigenous peoples. So I think that this abuse has to do a lot with what we could call the abuse of power from the practiced by the government. All this has to do with self-determination and with self-government, because we have to see because we have to try to inspire ourselves in our indigenous philosophy and try to get the proper use of our territories. We have, of course, there is a legal framework. We have a constitution in Colombia, but the use has been confined just to the penal area and not with the interests on the territory. So there are the Ministry of Interior, and there we have these criminal proceedings against indigenous peoples, and with this they are weakening our self-government, and there is an absence of representation of our indigenous nationalities. So this abuse of power has to do also with the right to self-determination based on the cultures and the traditions in these different spaces. That is something that is vital for indigenous peoples. It's always vulnerated and manipulated. There's an impunity against the violation of the human rights, and there are these elites that have practices land grabbing on our territories, strengthening the armed conflict, because we have this activity of the military in our region, and also this counterposition with guerrilla activity, and that's something that we see everywhere in our territories. And this is getting worse and worse. The situation of the indigenous peoples we are living in this moment, and we have this statistic, for instance, in Cauca or Putumayo, and all these different regions, and also in the other departments, even if there is not this specific persecution or this massacre, anyway, there is a resistance of indigenous peoples in trying that mining activities, extractive industries, and so on, stop with the activity as the model intends to. There are no guarantees of human rights in our territories. That's something we can say openly. Nothing that allows us to live in peace in order to defend ourselves from the political and administrative system we have here implemented by our government. And well, I wanted to share this with you because we can't reduce the topic of the human rights only to the extermination or the physical extermination because of the armed conflict, but also we have to speak about the politics of the government, and we can't permit that the indigenous cultures disappear because of lack of rights, because of lack of established political rights, and that international tools or national tools, legal tools instituted for indigenous peoples are manipulated and it be just taken into account in the interest of the state so that the state can develop its vision or its mission, its economic mission, and so that we as indigenous peoples are permanently trying to see the way of trying to survive. We think that something basic here, with all these crimes and massacres that are happening, all this has to do also with a vision of indigenous people that makes it possible that there is a guarantee of the human rights. With this, I'd like to give you, make some sort of summary of the situation we are living now in this country that is still very bad, very serious. What's happening? We don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. The only thing we find is just some sort of regression in our rights. And that's why we want to be with our communities to guarantee the rights for all of them, and in order to be able to strengthen ourselves as peoples, in order to resist the political system in Colombia. Thank you very much for your participation. And I hope that IPRI can help us to get further on our path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonor, and thank you very much for stressing the impacts of violence and criminalization in weakening, especially in weakening autonomy and self-government in Colombia. I will come back to you with some questions after we finish with our other panelists. So our next speaker is May Takiban, who is a lawyer and a law professor. She is the Executive Director of Legal Rights and Natural Resources in the Philippines, and she has been actively engaged in filing a case in the Philippines against the Anti-Terrorism Act. So, Mai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vicky, and good evening to everyone. I beg your patience as I go through my presentation as briefly as I could. So in the Philippines, we've had a long history of crafting laws that intend to subjugate its own people, not to stifle dissent, to maintain the power and the systems of the status quo. This is an unfortunate part of our colonial tradition that we maintain, that is maintained through this day. It is also a system that we've seen to have historically marginalized indigenous peoples. Let me see. So for the Duterte administration, he has crafted our national security policy. Its aspiration, its rhetoric is supposed to address the root causes of Filipino communities' insecurity. But as we can see in its executive order, its primary aim is really to quell existing secessionist movements and ideological rebellions. This had the power of an executive order until he has co-opted, I guess, our lawmaking systems. No, recently he was able to pass our lower house, our Congress, was able to pass the anti-terror law. No, which was swiftly signed into law by the president himself. Here, the Duterte administration's approach to human security is really one of war framing. You know, I'm sure many of you have heard of his drug war, no, and how he even would frame the pandemic as war against COVID-19. And so now he has this catch-all phrase for war against terrorism. And so this law is supposed to answer to that. But really, The Anti-Terrorism Act of 2022 sets the stage for furthering the state's security agenda. No? Here, the state uses another layer to confuse, to conflate, obfuscate, by defining certain acts as terrorism, therefore, risk to the people and the state. It argues for a particular condition, a state of exemption, whereby constitutionally protected rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of dissent, and so on, are curtailed through the use of the state's police power. So, framed this way, social movements, indigenous peoples asserting their rights, community resistance can now be considered within the ambit of its definition of inciting to sedition or even as acts of terrorism. And this is what I meant to capture by the title of this presentation, which is, weaponizing the law. It is in many ways criminalizing dissent, which is criminalizing assertion, assertion of peoples to assert their rights. And so it gives the state, this administration, a cover for eliminating dissent and resistance within supposed to be a landscape of democracy. But for indigenous peoples, human security starts with addressing ancestral land and domain rights. The inherent right to own, manage, and control their lands, that has to be respected. However, from the very start, the policy of the state has been inconsistent with indigenous customs and traditional understanding of land ownership. We in the Philippines, we've adopted colonial laws regarding land ownership, all of which echo the assertion of the state as owning the land. As such, this puts in conflict the interest of many indigenous communities. Moreover, the policy on economic development, the national security has worsened this conflict, aggravating already difficult conditions of indigenous communities. You have transnational corporations, foreign interests such as mining, agro-industrial, energy, have invaded ancestral lands, and driven by liberalization and profit, the state has become, and with the law, at its backing, become complicit in the dispossession of indigenous peoples of their ancestral lands. Here we see, this is very recent. This is a barricade by an indigenous communities up north in the Philippines against OceanaGold, a big mining corporation. And this was during the cover of the pandemic. And as they did their barricade, what was charged of them, another way of weaponizing the law, is the breach of quarantine guidelines. So they were penalized. Their leaders were taken to prison. It isn't surprising that the anti-terror laws first hit were actually indigenous peoples in Zambales. And while this law requires that it is the police force that should conduct the arrest, in this case, it was the military that did the arrests. They were supposed to be, they had, their alleged crime was supposed to have killed a soldier. There are reports of torture, illegal detention, insofar as this case is concerned. But as we see here, and if you can see through the dates of this CALD reports, this is nothing new, way back when this administration, as in previous administration, had already used red tagging, and red tagging has always been often used in synonymous terms as that of a terrorist. Whether this was a school organization, whether this was your United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous People, Vicky has herself almost been prescribed for speaking against the actions of the government. What gives us a bit of hope is that there is some movement. There's some raging, escalating consciousness among society groups, among indigenous peoples as well in the Philippines. And so against this anti-terror law, we filed the case against its constitutionality. It's worthy to note that our petitioners that we represent are mostly indigenous peoples, also Moro peoples, but that among these indigenous peoples would be, a lot of them are women leaders, that have taken really the cudgels of defending rights. So the Philippines is one of the first countries to pass an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, to put in law protection, respect of Indigenous peoples, and supposed to be it would put in hollow terms, self-determination and the respect of integrity of their values, practices, and institutions. But here, uh, as a result of state interest, they simply become, or communities simply become, collateral damage, in the bid for liberalization, in the bid for economic exploitation, resulting in a lot of natural resources being plundered. Um, this administration has aggravated this because in many ways it has legalized, it has legalized what had been traditionally considered as really repression, um, systemic violation against indigenous peoples through this anti-terror law. So I think I will stop there. I think my time is up. My 7 minutes is up, and maybe we can discuss more later in the open forum. So thank you very much, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Mai. It's really amazing how you see all the similarities that are happening in the three countries that we have seen so far. And the situation in the Philippines, of course, is a very serious concern, when especially with the enactment of this law. So later on, I will also come back again and ask some questions. But I would like to move now to our last speaker, who is Abel Barrera, who is the founder and director of the Centro de Derechos Humanos de la Montaña Tlachinolan. He is an anthropologist and a human rights expert. And in 2010, he was awarded by Amnesty International with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award for his work in the center. So Abel, please, you take the floor.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Mucho gusto desde
Hello,
Tlapa.
everyone. Thank you very much. Welcome from Mexico, from Tlapa, Guerrero, from the mountain. I would like to start with a thought about the situation of the indigenous people regarding what's been going on during these last 2 years. I make reference that in December 2018, the new president became president. When he came into power, he did it at the base of the city with the presence of indigenous people. That meant the inclusion of indigenous people. But we know there is a gap between the facts and the reality we're living day after day in a country. I will just like to say that thanks to our special rapporteur, Victoria came here in Mexico and she presented a report in 2017. And since then, the situation of indigenous people here hasn't changed. In fact, it has been worse, especially right now with the COVID-19 situation, and also especially because of the violence and the criminalization that persists. We have identified 132 cases that were done during this period, and that have had an impact in 31 out of 64 indigenous communities. We have found 23 out of 32 states in our republic that have been suffering from violence. And I have to underline Chiapas, Oaxaca, Guerrero, Chihuahua, Jalisco, Yucatan, Michoacán, y Puebla. That is where we found some of the most, like one of the biggest projects that the government is supporting that have to do with thermoelectric industries and mining industries that have been already been created years ago. We are also worried about the the threat of death to indigenous leaders. There is also a pattern of criminalization and forced displacement. We haven't found a valid strategy to help on the topic of indigenous rights. The criminal organizations have had a high impact in many different regions of the country where indigenous people can be found. For example, in Yucatan Peninsula, there has been an impact due to the Tren Maya project. It has affected the indigenous communities, and the Office of the United Nations in Mexico, they had underlined their concern because the free, prior, and informed consent hasn't been accomplished. And the government didn't agree with this because they thought they did everything okay, but there wasn't some people and some opinions that haven't been heard. There's another project that is getting stronger, which is the Corredor Transísmico in Oaxaca. There is resistance. The society has been divided, even inside one community, and it has also highlighted the disqualification from the government against the oppositors to this mega project, to this project. One of the main problems and something that is happening with the indigenous people is the killing of Yamil Nawa that was opposed to the electrical project in Kuala Morenos. He was murdered on the 20th February of 2019. And still nowadays, we don't know anything about the investigation. The murders are still impune. And also on the 24th November 2020, the opposition to the thermoelectric has been evicted by the police. And also with the government of López Obrador, the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, has appeared. They are trying to maintain the order and contain the social movements. And the government has been turning to these services to stop the social movement, and the indigenous people have seen their budget decreased, but the budget for the military forces has increased. We're left without any budget, and they have allocated these budgets for, and this budget has been allocated for the military forces. I also want to highlight the situation in Chiapas. We know that in Chiapas, there is a movement that keeps growing strong, the indigenous Zapatistas, and they are apart from the government. They don't feel represented by the government, but we still have violence in Chiapas. For example, Aldamas and Chalo, two regions of Chiapas that have been many violences, and we have had 997 violent acts. 2,036 displacements and many deaths. Here we have seen that there is a situation that where the people that have been displaced have still suffer from violence, and the armed groups are left without control. And also in Oaxaca, we had to face a very difficult situation back in June on 2020, where indigenous from the Icos people were murdered. There were 13 people that died during this time. We knew it was going to be a massacre, genocide because of the armed conflict, and we didn't try to stop these armed groups to kill these people. In Chihuahua, the communities Jaramuri and Yoreme, they had to face a huge problem of displacement and abandoning. And where the government can't reach, we can see the growing of armed groups. Children and young adolescents have been recruited for these armed groups. Children that haven't studied. Right now, there are 5,000 people from the Rajano community that have been living in Sinaloa. And right now they're living in Durango. As you can see, we see organized crime displacing people. We also see an aggression and violence pattern for Radamulis communities that are found in really bad situations. I also want to underline that the problem of agro-violence, our Special Rapporteur Victoria has already seen that problem. There is not a law, a juridic framework to respect the territories, and we can't neither find any law in the government in order to solve the agro-violence. Here in Guerrero, there have been murders, aggressions, systemic violence, and the authorities haven't acted. And at last, I would like to say that we're really worried about organized crime and the actors in indigenous territories. There is also the support to big projects. The government is supporting this huge project, and they are not taking into account the opinion of the indigenous people, and they're not letting them take part of these improvement of these situations and the decision. So indigenous people just had to face the situation. And it's just against the speech that the indigenous people should be a part of the country. If we see the violence, the criminalization, and the criminalization of their leader, it has been the reality during these last years. And we couldn't start a discussion about a whole reformation of the indigenous rights. We have tried it at a state level, but we didn't succeed because the government and the lawmakers are not interested. There are many facts, but we don't legislate and we don't protect indigenous communities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Abel. Really, the situation, it's very sad to hear that the situation has even further deteriorated after my visit there in 2017. And this really speaks to the harsh realities that indigenous are facing. And as you said, it's not just the state or the corporations that are affecting indigenous peoples, but also organized crime. No, and so I want to know, and I think this question that I'll pose a few questions before I open it to the questions of the participants. But one of the things that I've seen in Mexico as well as in Colombia is that there are indigenous guards. No, there are indigenous guards who are protecting the communities, and in fact I met several of them. No, when I was in Mexico, I had meetings with them. I was wondering, how is the situation of the indigenous guards? No, are they able to continue to protect the community, or are they the ones who are also being criminalized?
Quiero poner el ejemplo de Estado de Guerrero, Victoria. Aquí hemos impulsado una ley precisamente para proteger los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, porque resulta que hace 3 años estaba una ley que protegía los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y reconocía a lo que llamamos en México la policía comunitaria, que son precisamente estas guardias del pueblo, y que quitaron esa ley los diputados. Y entonces los pueblos se quedaron sin esa ley que protegía. En verdad, ha habido una deliberada acción de desconocer, de criminalizar a la policía comunitaria. Por la vía de los hechos, sí, en verdad se han interpuesto denuncias en contra de ellos. Ha habido en otros momentos encarcelamientos.
Without any complaints, and the fact is that the peoples have exerted their right to have the community police, as you called it, Vicky, and it is something very important in the relation between indigenous people and states, because they've also said they're not going to allow anymore that this community police continues to perform their security task and justice task in our peoples, and they didn't want to recognize that, but in fact they are still doing their work, and it's important because the exercise of their work is part of our right to self-organization, to have our own security bodies. And so we hope that there's going to be soon a new law. There is already a bill that perhaps is well. Anyway, we have to work to work on it, in order that it can be performed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Leonor, would you like to respond to that question? Because that's also the situation in Colombia. Would you like to respond to what is the situation of the indigenous guards that have been protecting some of the communities in Colombia, the indigenous communities?
Muy bien. El tema de guardias indígenas en Colombia no es
it's a question, well, it's something that belongs to all our cultures. We all protect ourselves by different means, and it is already something that belongs to the tradition of our peoples. But there are some cultures of our indigenous peoples where the visible form of having guardians is something very important in the protection of their territories and the protection of the collective protection of the communities. The situation is that the state, the government, the political system don't recognize in depth the way of life and the way of being indigenous, and that's exactly the root of the problem. And all this has to do with this idea of having indigenous guards, because it goes in the direction of the needs of our indigenous people, and that's why we have all these murders, and that's why we've had all these confrontations, because the indigenous guards are not an armed group in this sense. They follow their own traditions and their own way of organizing themselves. But the response of the violent groups has been quite violent. That's a problem we are seeing now in Colombia. This confrontation, this lack of symmetry that doesn't correspond with how things should be. And this is how situations deteriorating with this violation of fundamental right of many peoples with our guardians. Other peoples have other means of protecting themselves that also have where they also have traditional practices, and they are also basic for us, so that we don't need to have to make use of this capitalistic way of vision of life, and or a different way of life anyway than that is the one that is ours. And so it's something we have to get institutional response to our demands if we want to resolve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lenore. There is a question for you, Sonia. I'm thankful that you are still around. And the question is where these fundamentalist evangelical groups that go to the communities of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, are they being brought in by the churches or by the government? You unmute yourself. You are on mute still. Did you get the question? The question is whether who is bringing in these evangelical groups into the communities of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. So unmute yourself, please. Sound. Okay.
Não, desculpa, é que eu não tinha escutado a tradução quando ela falou antes, né? Bom, há essa presença já de missionários dentro de muitos territórios indígenas e sempre houve movimento.
There has always been a movement, of the indigenous. I am translating. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No. Okay. So there has always been this presence of missionaries in the indigenous lands, and as a very strong movement in order to curtail this presence. And now the government is legitimizing and authorizing through measures, institutional measures, whether decrees or ordinances, the presence of these missionaries in indigenous lands. So there is this, nowadays this authorization of the federal government so that they can remain in our territories. Of course, this is a crime and very serious act, aggression to the cultures and ways of life of the indigenous peoples. And that impact upon mostly the peoples who are in voluntary isolation, because there's this attempt of forcing in the indigenous to join these religions, especially the fundamentalist ones. So it's a risk to the peoples.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nia. Mai, there's also a question for you related to the Anti-Terrorism Act in the Philippines, which is asking on which portions of the act are violating indigenous people's rights. But I just wanted to add another question, which is what do you hope to achieve with the case that you filed against the Supreme Court on the constitutionality of the Anti-Terrorism Act, and what kind of support do you need, in pursuing this act that you did, this case that you filed against the Supreme Court, against the government?
Wow, that's quite a question. How much time do we have? Because the petition, the petition is actually seeking to consider the whole law unconstitutional, because in and of itself, it breaches on, for example, the right to privacy. It encroaches on freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. Your constitutionally protected rights, many of the rights that are enshrined, in fact, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, could easily be breached by the anti-terrorism law. And in many ways, it puts indigenous peoples in even more aggravated situations because of where they are, in very far geographic areas, very far from population areas. Certainly a lot of the things that are going on right now, because a lot of media coverage in the Philippines and even globally is all about COVID. So a lot of the things that are happening in communities are not being covered. So a lot of development aggression backed by security forces of the state are not reported. As I pointed out in the report earlier, the first casualties, quote unquote, of this anti-terror law are indigenous peoples, and that gives us an illustration, of how this law is actually legitimizing state police power exercise to curtail dissent, and many others. I could go on and on with this law, but in gist, yeah, pretty much we want to declare it unconstitutional.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This question is addressed to you all. No, there's a question about what are the indigenous grassroots movements doing to further raise the awareness on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is of course one of the main instruments for the protection of indigenous people's rights. So maybe if you can, any of you can respond to that question. How are the indigenous social movements working towards raising awareness of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and using this to further assert and claim their rights as indigenous peoples? Abel, would you like to respond to that?
En primer lugar, creo.
First of all, I think that it's important to underline the movement of indigenous, of the Zapatistas in Chiapas is one of the most important movements. It's a movement that started in 1994 as a protest and as a means of giving visibility of these indigenous peoples that have been trod on during so many centuries, and aiming at a constitutional reform. But regretfully, the official parties reduced this reform, and so the right to the self-determination was interrupted or was diminished. From these years on, indigenous peoples, Zapatismo and so on in Chiapas, declared that they were going to continue the fight, the autonomic fight, not taking into account the state because they felt they were not represented. I think it's a very important movement. In this last 6 years, the Zapatistas said they were not going to establish a relationship with the federal government because they were not really being supported And so they proclaimed that it was the same situation as before, and that finally the situation of Chiapas, the militarization or the paramilitarization, the divisions, internal divisions have generated this dismantling of the community in life. And that's why this process of this grassroots process has been very important for our countries, and is an international reference. And at the same time, we have had also other movements in Oaxaca, in Guerrero, precisely with these community polices in Oaxaca, the movements that fought for the defense of territory in the communities. And I think it has been quite relevant, all this force that has been shown all over the country.
Thank you very much, Abel. Leonor, do you want to respond to that question as well? Like you are a member of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. Is that a framework that is helping address also these issues as well as promote the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples?
Muy bien. A ver, yo creo que...
Yes, of course. I think that on an international level, or even a national level, there are already elements, mechanisms, tools, or however you want to call them. But as long as there is no political will of the government of performing this, and of using this legal framework of rights, of using this framework of political actions, like, for instance, ratifying, passing, or even assessing, or even verifying everything by means of the special rapporteurs, with also the of United Nations or Organization of American countries. I think, being realistic, there is no articulation of these actions with indigenous peoples. I want to say that if indigenous peoples, with their capacities, they exist already, and we don't know if they can be adapted, or not only just adapted, but be recognized. So important topics of the lives of indigenous peoples, of their different collectivities, not only of the, I'm speaking of particular cases, or particular cases included in the collective area. It's always a question of faith, of hope, of good faith, but that's not enough when you don't execute, if you don't implement these rights in concrete things, the respect to our culture, respect to our traditions, respect to our rights. But if the political intervention and the religious intervention stops to intervene in our territories, so that we are seen as equals, there, that's why we can't think that we are. I don't think that we are yet at the right level. Indigenous peoples have to work from the idea, starting with a social, environmental reconstruction. The rights of course, are written down in the high courts, in the institutions, and the international bodies. Of course, all these rights are written down everywhere. But the particular right is written in nature. It's something that belongs to nature, is part of nature, is part of the or tradition of the peoples. And I think that it is there we have to act on, and where we have to apply these things. And that's why I think we have to continue insisting that this implementation has to be according to this reality of each and every one of the different countries that makes us different, as for instance the case of our traditional cultures. And so the politics of the states want to want to protect this diversity, so they have to act in this direction. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you very much, Leonor. Sonia, you are the executive coordinator of APIB, the National Network of Indigenous Peoples in Brazil. So maybe you can also say something about what APIB is doing, in relation to these issues, as well as raising awareness on the declaration.
Bom, não temos dúvida que
We have no doubt that the statement by the United Nations is a tool, is a legal tool, an important one for the implementation of the rights of indigenous peoples in the whole world, who are co-signatories, as well as we have many other treaties which are important, such as the Paris Agreement that ensured this indigenous platform, or the New York Statement of 2014, which also acknowledged these rights and the traditional knowledge of the peoples and traditional communities. So we do have important laws. We have laws that were built with the participation of indigenous peoples of different parts of the world, which bring this reality. What is missing is the actual implementation of these tools. We have to see ways of making worth these treaties, because they exist on the paper and they contain all this reality. So this mobilization, this articulation that we are doing in networks beyond borders, beyond country borders, it's important in order to unify this fight and in order to pressure for the actual putting practice of this statement. We are together so that in one day this statement would become truth, should be enforced.
Thank you very much, Sonia. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to use these few minutes to summarize a bit what you have, all the rich contributions that you have, and maybe talk a little bit about what IPRI is doing in relation to these issues. Basically, we have seen from the contributions of all of you, the members of the panel, a very common situations wherein hate speech is being used against indigenous peoples. As Sonia has said, it is the mass production of fake news, and also the use of hate speech in various media, whether the mainstream media or the social media, and this further exacerbates the discrimination against indigenous peoples, the racism against indigenous peoples, and of course the stigmatization of indigenous peoples. So clearly this is a violation, of the rights, the basic human rights of indigenous peoples who want to protect their lands, territories, and resources, their cultures, as well as their indigenous governments or other autonomies and self-governance systems. And you have also mentioned about all these measures being taken to criminalize and to persecute indigenous peoples has also created a lot of course, displacements, evictions from the community, the development aggression that is being pushed by the state and also by the corporations has pushed indigenous peoples to be evicted from their communities, as well as caused a lot of divisions also. Has weakened the strong community unities that have been existing for a long time. And you have also mentioned about the fact that one form of genocide against indigenous peoples is also through statistics, where they don't faithfully reflect the real number of indigenous peoples, and of course the news about murders, assassinations against indigenous peoples doesn't come out in the media as we would like these to be made more visible. No, you also talked about the role of organized crime, no, in terms of further weakening indigenous peoples' communities, and also, of course, leading also to some deaths, no, of indigenous peoples, and the recruitment of young indigenous peoples. So these are just a few of the collective impacts, no, that it has. But I also mentioned the collective impacts on the cultures, no, and the cultures and the lifestyles of indigenous peoples. So these collective impacts that are adverse impacts of violence and criminalization against indigenous peoples really is a serious problem that cuts across borders. And we just have 4 countries here, but if we open this up to other countries, I am almost sure that this is going to be many cases are similar, no? And this is very unfortunate, especially considering that this is now the 75th year, no, of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Declaration on Human Rights. And of course, it's the 13th year of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The areas where we have hope is the fact that indigenous peoples are not taking these issues lying down. They are resisting. I know in Colombia you have Mingas, no? You have a huge resistance as well is in Brazil, in Mexico, and even in the Philippines, as you had seen even during the period of COVID. The indigenous peoples in one part of the country have protested against a mining company. No, so there are protests that are still continuing, no, even in the face of these kinds of human rights violations. And I think the acts that you are talking to denounce and say that this normalization of criminal, of these kinds of criminal acts should really be denounced, as these are the most serious violations against the rights of indigenous peoples, no? And Mai has stressed that this kind of, making stigmatizing indigenous peoples, tagging them as communists, as terrorists, as anti-development, this is being normalized, no? It's like a common rhetoric, common narrative that we hear every day. And therefore, we really need to protest against this and to state that many of what indigenous peoples are doing is actually just protecting their collective rights to their lands and territories for them to continue to live with the kind of development that they chose for themselves, and the right to actively participate in any decision or any project or any action being taken by the government that directly affects them. No, so that is something that we have fought for under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that we have the right to actively participate and be included in all decision-making processes that affect us, and thus free, prior, informed consent should be obtained whenever such projects are brought into our territories. IPRI has been looking at this situation that you have described, and we have been engaging with you all in terms of how we can work together. And of course, our common actions are really launching global campaigns, no, petitions, letters to the actors that are involved in these kinds of human rights violations, as well as linking indigenous peoples together, solidarity. We need to talk to each other so we will understand better how we can help each other to protect our rights, and also with other social movements, no, whether these are environmental movements or the women's movements all the social movements that are equally concerned and fighting against discrimination, inequality, and injustice. No, all these are forms of injustice as well to indigenous peoples who have done nothing but to protect the territories, which are now being seen as solutions to the problems of climate change, as well as to biodiversity erosion and the erosion of cultural diversity. I think we are all convinced that indigenous peoples have contributed a lot in sustaining the world's remaining ecosystems, and we are contributing to the problems that most governments face, the world faces, and therefore our rights to continue doing these actions should be protected. IPRI also has been sending letters, no, petitions, as well as it has set up its own legal and sanctuary fund, which supports indigenous peoples who want to file cases in situations where their rights are being violated, or who need sanctuary if they are threats, if their lives are under threat, no, by not just by the state, not just by corporations, but also by organized crime. I think this picture doesn't really speak well of what has been achieved by the duty bearers of human rights, which are the states. No, the states are the are the key duty bearers of human rights, and it is the responsibility to implement, to comply with all the international human rights conventions that they have ratified. No, in Latin America, we know that ILO Convention 169 has been ratified by many states, and this is an additional legal instrument that should be used. We are also calling on the courts and the commissions, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, as well as the other regional courts like the African Court on Human and People's Rights and Commission on Human and People's Rights, to support further the indigenous peoples as they assert their rights and in situations where their rights are being grossly violated by the duty bearers, which are the states. So with that, we would like to thank you all for participating in this webinar. We hope we will be able to continue talking about the kinds of solidarity that we need to strengthen amongst ourselves, as well as the actions that we all collectively can do together to stop the normalization of these kinds of acts being done against indigenous peoples. No, we have to insist that it's the respect and the protection and fulfillment of indigenous people's rights that will help strengthen the states, the nations where we find ourselves in, and that will also strengthen the capacity, our capacity as human beings to protect ourselves from the adverse impacts of climate change. So I thank you all. Leonor Salabata from Colombia, Sonia Guajajara from Brazil, Abel Barrera from Mexico, and Mai Takiban from the Philippines. We strongly support the efforts that you are all taking, and we would like to continue this kind of conversation and actions that we are all jointly taking, because that's the only way that we can rectify and correct all these violations that are being done and justified, even through laws, that are being made by the parliaments of our government. So more power to you all. In spite of the fact that this situation is very bad, we still call for a celebration of the adoption of the UN Declaration, the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Tomorrow is International Human Rights Day. We still affirm that these international human rights treaties, conventions, and instruments are the instruments that need to be implemented and complied with, because that is what's going to bring about a humane, a just, and a more sustainable world. Thank you very much. And good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you all. Thank you. Thank you very much to the people who work behind the scenes. There's Joanne, who is the co-director of IPRI. We thank you all, as well as to Manja, to Eds, to Ivan, to Joyce, no, who have all supported in making this webinar possible. And thank you for taking time out to celebrate International Human Rights Day with us. Bye. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, thank you so much. Okay.
Ya ponle en leads.
Adiós.